A box mislabeled Hydrology, Irkutsk, 1962, sits deep in a Siberian archive. Its papers are warped, edges brittle with water stains. On the first page is a phrase that should not belong in a scientific file. Voices heard beneath the ice. Location, Lake Baikal. The notation is stamped to be reviewed by Directorate P, a reference to a little-known department of the KGB tasked with investigating anomalous phenomena with potential national security implications. Lake Baikal is the deepest body of fresh water on Earth, a chasm of ice and pressure, older than any empire. Since the 19th century, locals told stories of strange cries rising from the frozen surface, chants that carried across the tundra on windless nights. Soviet power dismissed these as folklore, remnants of Buryat shamanism. But after 1959, when military divers trained beneath Baikal's surface during classified exercises, those whispers became more than myth. The first incident is buried in a training log. Divers descending past 30 meters reported choral resonance echoing through their equipment. Not the groans of ice, not the distortion of faulty gear, but organized sound, voices in unison. One diver, Lieutenant Andreev, wrote that he recognized the structure as polyphonic chanting, like a church choir. Yet no sound source was visible, no human presence beneath the ice. He surfaced in panic, only to be reprimanded for imaginative weakness. Weeks later, Andreev drowned during a routine training drill. The official explanation: equipment failure. The men who trained with him whispered otherwise, that he had been pulled downward by something no human hand touched. Through the 1960s, reports multiplied. Soviet engineers drilling near the lake for seismic studies recorded unexplained harmonics on their instruments. A declassified page from 1965 lists frequency signatures consistent with human vocal range detected at depth 120 meters. Next to it, someone had scrawled in pencil, "Voices of the drowned." The note is unsigned. Local accounts align disturbingly with these files. Fishermen claimed they heard singing beneath the ice during late winter when the lake froze thick. They described it as a cathedral sound, vast and layered, carrying words they could not understand. Some swore it resembled Old Church Slavonic, though none could identify the phrases. Elders warned that to listen too long was dangerous, that those who lingered near the holes in the ice risked being taken. More than one disappearance was attributed to the Baikal voice. By the early 1970s, the Soviet Navy took interest. A series of exercises, codenamed Project NERPA, stationed divers at Baikal to test new suits and breathing systems. The divers' logs remain classified, but one fragment surfaced in 1991. It describes 7 men descending together. At 35 meters, they reported not only hearing the voices, but seeing figures in pale suits beneath them, humanoid shapes without equipment, moving effortlessly in the black water. 3 divers attempted pursuit. Moments later, they lost consciousness. All 7 were dragged to the surface, where emergency decompression failed. 2 died instantly, 4 were crippled, 1 never regained speech. Officially, the incident never occurred. Unofficially, it spread among Baikal towns as proof of the under-ice choir. Throughout the Cold War, Baikal became ringed with monitoring stations disguised as limnological research labs. Villagers noticed the sudden presence of antennae, unmarked boats, and soldiers on the shore. Scientists told locals they were measuring oxygen levels and plankton growth. Yet leaked documents suggest their true purpose: to record the sounds rising through the ice. Tape reels recovered in the 1990s contain eerie harmonics, a layered drone broken by syllables that mimic human chanting. Some analysts claimed they were artifacts of shifting ice. Others swore they heard words forming: pleas, prayers, commands. The files grow darker after 1978. A report marked top secret records loss of entire diving unit during recovery mission, no survivors. Cause of death, unspecified acoustic trauma. The bodies were said to bleed from ears and eyes, as though exposed to overwhelming sound pressure. Yet their suits were intact, oxygen reserves unspent. The families were told they perished in routine training accidents. None of the coffins were opened at burial. As the Soviet Union faltered in the 1980s, surveillance of Baikal diminished, but local accounts intensified. Campers spoke of voices rising through cracks in the ice at night. Some claimed to hear their own names called. A Buryat shaman interviewed in 1986 whispered that the lake was a mouth and that the drowned sing to be remembered. His words never reached print. He died in a car accident days later. After 1991, fragments of the Baikal archive slipped into the open market. Journalists found partial reels of underwater recordings, dissonant choirs, shifting harmonies, sounds that induced vertigo when played at full volume. Some researchers suggested the voices were a byproduct of seismic resonance. Others claimed the tones mapped perfectly onto known patterns of human choral music. None could explain why divers consistently described the same experience, the sensation of being surrounded by a choir too vast to see. Even now, in the thaw of spring, locals report hearing faint singing beneath the ice. Tourists dismiss it as wind, but fishermen insist the sound is real. Scientists continue to argue, but the files that remain tell a more disturbing story: that the Soviet Union knew of the Baikal voice, studied it, tried to weaponize it, and failed. What it was, a natural anomaly, a hallucination, or something far older than the Soviet state, remains unanswerable, but the voices have not stopped. They rise each winter, unbound by ideology or denial, echoing from a depth no diver can reach. And so the question lingers: was Lake Baikal merely the site of a Cold War experiment gone wrong, or does it hide something the Soviets could never control? A choir of the lost, still singing beneath the ice, waiting for someone to listen too long? The second bundle of documents tied to the Baikal voice begins with a series of incident reports from 1960 to 1963, filed not by scientists, but by local militia units. They describe fishermen found dead beside holes in the ice, their nets still in the water, faces frozen in expressions of awe rather than fear. The official cause of death was always exposure or accidental drowning, yet one officer's handwritten note betrays unease. Bodies retrieved from shore show no signs of immersion, boots dry, yet lungs contain water. Such contradictions appear repeatedly, suggesting deaths that did not follow the expected rules of accident or hypothermia. Locals whispered that the lake was taking people, not by storm or icebreak, but by sound. Entire families claimed to hear choruses at night when winds fell silent, harmonies so clear they seemed to come from underfoot. Testimonies speak of choirs numbering dozens of voices, singing in a language unfamiliar but strangely familiar in cadence, like fragments of Slavic liturgy. Children covered their ears, saying the singing hurt, while elders insisted the songs resembled Znameni chant from before the revolution. The stories spread despite attempts by party officials to label them bourgeois superstition. In early 1962, a small detachment of Navy divers was ordered to investigate near Listvianka. The file is badly degraded, but one account remains legible. At a depth of 25 meters, divers radioed back that they heard layered voices, as if in a chamber. Their instruments registered oscillations, yet no geological event was recorded nearby. Then the signal broke. Only 2 of the 5 resurfaced, both incoherent, blood streaming from their ears. They repeated the same phrase, "They are calling us." Within days, both men were transferred to a psychiatric facility in Irkutsk and erased from active duty rosters. At the same time, scientific logs show anomalies in Baikal's ice acoustics. Researchers with the Academy of Sciences measured frequency bands inconsistent with known ice cracking or seismic stress. Instead, the tones aligned with 400-800 Hz within human vocal range. One note, nearly blacked out by redaction, reads, "Pattern shows polyphony, structure consistent with intentional composition." This detail never appeared in public papers. only in internal circulation, under Directorate P. Rumors of forbidden experiments began to spread in Irkutsk and Severodbaikalsk. Villagers swore they saw trucks arriving at night, unloading strange cylindrical containers that were lowered onto the ice. By morning, the sites were covered in snow and guarded by soldiers. Some said the authorities were recording the lake, others that they were broadcasting into it, testing whether the voices would respond. A fisherman later claimed that on one such night, he saw the ice itself vibrating in rhythm, as if struck by invisible hands. Folklore grew darker. Buryat elders recalled an older tale, that Baikal was a mirror between worlds, and those who drowned were not lost, but absorbed, their voices joining an endless choir beneath the surface. This myth, long suppressed, began to circulate quietly again, reinforced by the mounting incidents. Even party members admitted privately to hearing sounds while patrolling in winter. Yet every official statement insisted there was nothing unusual, only natural echoes, tricks of temperature, the imagination of frightened villagers. The dossier closes this phase with a chilling cable dated December 1963. Further training exercises in Baikal suspended. Risk to personnel unacceptable. However, phenomenon persists. Recommend continued monitoring under cultural camouflage. The phrase cultural camouflage is telling. It implies the authorities intended to hide surveillance behind folklore to let the legend serve as a mask for ongoing state attention. From this point onward, the Baikal voice ceased to be only a local superstition. It became a classified anomaly, studied in secrecy, denied in public, and etched into the invisible margin between Cold War science and myth. The lake's surface froze as it always had, but beneath, the sense grew that something vast and ancient was singing, waiting for those who dared to listen. The third layer of the Baikal Voice Archive opens with a telegram stamped Soversheno Sekretno, Top Secret, dated February 1965. The message was sent from a naval outpost near Severodbaikalsk to Moscow headquarters, reporting severe psychological disturbances among divers stationed at Lake Baikal. 3 men had to be removed from service after claiming they could hear 1,000 voices rising through the hull of the boat while patrolling under the ice. Their commanding officer insisted the sounds were echoes of cracking ice, but the men refused to return to duty, one attempting suicide in the barracks. In the margins of the telegram, someone wrote in blue pencil, "This is no longer a question of discipline, but of exposure." The next set of documents includes reel-to-reel recordings. One tape, marked only with the number 47, contains a low hum interspersed with what sound like human voices. Analysts from the Leningrad Acoustic Laboratory transcribed portions into phonetic symbols, concluding that patterns indicate speech, organized into strophes resembling chant. Another analyst, perhaps more cautious, wrote, "Do not release results. Interpretation may cause unnecessary speculation." The tape was filed away, yet copies circulated secretly among researchers. A surviving transcript from 1967 includes this chilling annotation. Harmonics correspond to 6 to 8 voices, yet divers insist they heard hundreds. Possible interference from depth? By the late 1960s, Soviet military interest sharpened. With the Cold War intensifying, the possibility that the phenomenon could be exploited or weaponized was raised in internal discussions. A file labeled Baikal Acoustic Field, military application outlines experiments to test whether prolonged exposure to the underwater voices could disorient divers or submarine crews. Trials were conducted with volunteers instructed to listen to recordings for extended periods. Reports note hallucinations, loss of time perception, and in one case, the sudden ability to recite entire passages of forgotten Orthodox hymns despite the subject having no religious background. The experiment was halted, officially due to unreliable data. Unofficially, margins in the file suggest the experiment ended because too many of the test subjects did not return to baseline consciousness. Folklore from the surrounding settlements only deepened the mystery. Elders told ethnographers that Baikal was a throat of the earth, swallowing voices and giving them back altered. Hunters swore they could hear choirs when the ice thickened in January, the sound carrying across the frozen expanse like bells. A retired fisherman, interviewed in 1970, described drilling a hole for his nets and hearing not water but a choir, distant but deliberate. He fled and never returned to the lake. When pressed, he admitted the singing seemed to address him directly, calling him by name. His account was dismissed publicly, but preserved privately in handwritten notes later smuggled out of the archives. By 1972, the KGB established what was called Laboratory 9 on Baikal's western shore, disguised as a fisheries research station. Declassified payroll lists show the staff included not only marine biologists but physicists, linguists, and even theologians. Their purpose was to gather systematic data on the phenomenon. Surviving fragments describe attempts to lower hydrophones deep below the ice. The results are contradictory. Some tapes captured nothing but static. Others produced layered harmonics so strong they damaged playback equipment. A technician wrote, "Every time we listen, the voices shift, as if aware of being recorded. The darker side of the project appears in casualty reports. In 1973, 3 hydrophone operators went missing after conducting overnight measurements. Their raft was later found adrift, instruments intact, but the men were gone. Search teams discovered no bodies. Official cause of disappearance, ice fracture. Yet the report notes there were no cracks, no signs of struggle. In the margin of one page, underlined twice, they followed the sound. The villagers near Baikal noticed the increased military presence and began to craft their own explanations. Some whispered that the Soviets were drilling to contact the drowned, others that secret cities were being built beneath the lake. A Buryat folktale resurfaced about the choir of the dead, spirits of those lost in Baikal's depths who sang eternally until another joined them. The alignment between folklore and classified reports is striking. Both describe voices, both imply they call the living downward. The files also contain visual evidence. In 1975, divers returning from a mission reported seeing shapes in the depths, pale, elongated figures moving with unnatural ease. They described them as humanoids, without visible equipment, gliding through the dark water. Some swore the beings gestured, as if inviting them to follow. This report, known as the Baikal Swimmers Incident, has been repeatedly denied by officials, yet scattered testimonies remain. One diver's diary, seized and filed under confiscated materials, describes faces pressing against the ice from below, mouths open as though singing. He died of cardiac arrest weeks later. From this period, the project's documents begin to thin, as if someone was actively scrubbing the record. Pages are missing, entire reports crossed out in black ink. What remains carries an undertone of fear. A directive from 1976 states, "Acoustic anomalies must not be approached without authorization. Civilian exposure unacceptable. Any leaks to press to be countered with natural explanations." Still, whispers escaped. By the late 1970s, hikers and tourists reported hearing music in the ice. Some compared it to church choirs, others to machinery humming, yet always organized, deliberate. Journalists who attempted to publish stories found their work suppressed. A regional paper in Irkutsk planned a feature on the Baikal Choir in 1978. The issue was recalled before distribution. Surviving notes from the newsroom show a warning delivered by local officials. Baikal sings only in folklore, nothing more. But the voices never ceased. Divers continued to hear them, villagers continued to report them, and the files, fragmentary, redacted, yet persistent, continued to accumulate. Each new testimony reinforced a terrifying possibility that something beneath Baikal was not only alive but aware, a presence that spoke through sound, rising through the ice to meet those who dared to listen. And so the archive of the Baikal voice enters the 1980s with more questions than answers. The state had silenced the press, erased files, and buried witnesses, but the phenomenon itself resisted erasure. The deeper they tried to deny it, the stronger the voices seemed to grow, like a choir rehearsing endlessly, waiting for its performance to be heard. The fourth accumulation of records begins in 1978, when the Baikal monitoring station was upgraded under direct orders from Moscow. The cover story presented to the public was expanded fisheries research, but the surviving files reveal a very different reality, a renewed military acoustic program designed to map the unknown choir beneath the lake. Documents marked Baikal Resonance Survey detail deployments of high-powered sonar arrays, lowered under the ice at depths reaching 200 meters. The official goal was calibration. The classified addendum states, "Attempt to provoke responsive harmonics. Observe for structured return." The responses when they came were more than echoes. A surviving logbook records operators hearing what they described as choral answering patterns, exactly 11 seconds after pulses were emitted. One technician wrote that the return did not resemble reflected sonar at all, but intentional mimicry. Transcripts note sequences of tones forming ascending scales, followed by layered harmonics indistinguishable from human voices. Engineers debated whether this was a resonance anomaly unique to Baikal's geological basin, but a single phrase in a 1979 memo betrays deeper concern. If this is resonance, it is imitating language. The personnel assigned to these surveys began to report disturbing symptoms. Operators complained of headaches, insomnia, and a sensation of being observed. Divers stationed for long shifts under the ice spoke of dreams in which choirs sang not from beneath the water, but from inside their own skulls. A handwritten annotation on a medical file reads, "Patient insists voices are rehearsing through him. Claims melodies continue after waking. The entry is unsigned. Several such patients were transferred to closed psychiatric wards, their records sealed. Accidents multiplied." In January 1980, during a deep-water dive, one group of 7 divers vanished. Recovery teams found their lines severed cleanly, as if cut by blades, though no equipment failure was detected. Only one body was recovered, lungs burst, mouth frozen open in a silent scream. His colleagues noted that when the corpse was placed in the morgue, a low hum seemed to emanate from his chest cavity for several hours. The morgue staff filed no official report, but the rumor spread through Irkutsk hospitals. Within days, the body was removed to an undisclosed location. At the same time, folklore adapted. Locals around Listvyanka began calling the phenomenon Golos Ozera, the voice of the lake. Fishermen said the choirs were louder during Lent, though no church bells rang nearby. Stories circulated of figures under the ice, faces pressed upward as if trapped in glass, mouths moving in perfect unison. Some villagers swore they heard their own names sung at night, voices matching those of dead relatives. Though dismissed as superstition, these accounts eerily match classified reports from divers who described the same illusions. By 1982, the KGB's Directorate P declared Baikal a zone of special acoustic control. Surveillance expanded to include hydrophones along the shoreline, guarded under military secrecy. But the more they listened, the more the strangeness grew. Recordings captured entire sequences resembling hymns, complete with recognizable cadences and refrains. Analysts trained in linguistics attempted transcription. Some claimed fragments resembled Old Church Slavonic phrases. Others warned the patterns were deliberately misleading, as though something below was imitating ritual. One chilling report from 1983 describes a test in which pre-recorded Russian choral music was broadcast beneath the ice through submerged speakers. The response, captured minutes later, mirrored the broadcast, but altered it, stretching syllables, adding harmonies that no human choir could produce. Technicians monitoring the experiment described uncontrollable nausea and disorientation. 2 fainted. The official explanation filed was equipment resonance failure. The unofficial note in the margin reads, "The lake sang back." Discipline at the station began to crack. Several officers deserted, attempting to return to Irkutsk by foot. They were captured and interrogated. Their testimony, preserved in fragments, is harrowing. The voices followed us onto land. We could hear them in the trees. They will not stop. The men were reassigned to labor camps, and their names erased from the project roster. By 1984, even senior scientists grew uneasy. One memorandum to Moscow pleads, "We cannot control the phenomenon. Observation alone alters it. Recommend cessation before further losses." The recommendation was ignored. Funding increased, and a new phase of experimentation began, code-named Resonant Choir. But in the secrecy of these files, one theme repeats: the deeper the Soviets pressed, the more the phenomenon resisted. What had begun as unexplained underwater singing now seemed to respond, to adapt, even to anticipate attempts at study. A note scrawled in the margin of a final 1984 report captures the dread better than any scientific formula. It knows we are listening. From this moment onward, the Baikal voice ceased to be merely an acoustic anomaly. In the files, it became something else, an interlocutor, a presence beneath the ice, singing not only for itself, but for those who dared to hear. The fifth stratum of the Baikal voice file opens in 1985, at the height of the Soviet Union's paranoia, when secrecy was reflex rather than strategy. The cover sheet of the surviving folder reads, "For committee eyes only, Acoustic Project R." Inside are accident reports, transcripts, and fragments of tape reels, all suggesting the same thing. The phenomenon beneath the ice had grown stronger, more deliberate, and more dangerous. The first incident that year involved a team of divers near the Olkhon Island sector. According to the typed report, they were tasked with installing new hydrophones at a depth of 60 meters. Minutes after descent, their communications recorded not instructions or panic, but fragments of choral music, voices rising in harmony, layered as though from a massive choir. What startled investigators was that the melody matched a medieval Russian hymn long banned by Soviet authorities. The recording ends abruptly with static. Only 2 of the 6 divers resurfaced. Both were incoherent, describing faces below, hundreds, watching from the dark. They were declared unfit for service and transferred to a psychiatric institute in Novosibirsk. Other fragments in the file describe the spread of anomalies onto land. Workers at shoreline outposts reported waking to the sound of choirs outside their barracks. Yet when they stepped out, the frozen lake lay silent. Several complained of their watches running backward for minutes at a time, only to correct themselves later. In one chilling testimony, a guard swore he heard his late father's voice among the singing, calling his childhood nickname across the ice. His report was stamped psychological delusion and filed away. The technical staff, however, were not so quick to dismiss. Notes from acoustic engineers reveal they attempted to map the harmonics into spectrograms. What emerged was not random noise but ordered sequences, symmetries resembling language. A linguist brought in for analysis compared them to fragments of Church Slavonic and older Proto-Slavic structures. Her report, dated September 1985, concludes with the line, "This is not natural resonance. It is constructed." The linguist's name vanishes from records soon after. That winter, the monitoring station suffered what was described as a mass acoustic event. Hydrophones registered an unprecedented surge of frequencies, spanning the entire human vocal range simultaneously. Staff described the sensation as being inside a cathedral, surrounded on all sides by choirs. Several fainted. One technician bled from the ears. Another fled into the snow, never to be found. The log of that night ends with the words, "Voices increased beyond containment. Transmission impossible. We did not record. We were recorded." Local populations noticed the change as well. Residents in nearby villages reported their animals refusing to approach the frozen shoreline. Dogs howled at night, as if responding to invisible choruses. Fishermen abandoned holes drilled into the ice after hearing song fragments echoing upward. Buryat shamans revived old taboos, warning that the lake was now awake. Oral testimony collected secretly by ethnographers includes one phrase repeated again and again: "The drowned are no longer silent." The authorities responded with predictably heavy hands. Entire areas of shoreline were closed off under the pretext of military exercises. Villagers were warned that spreading superstitious rumors could result in arrest. Yet even party officials stationed at Baikal began to file their own uneasy observations. One local secretary noted in his journal that during a meeting, the electric lights dimmed in rhythm with a sound none of them wanted to name. His entry ends, "We did not look at each other. To acknowledge it was to give it power." The final entry of this folder is perhaps the most unsettling. It is a partial transcript of a tape labeled Choir Contact, 12-12-85. The voices are faint but undeniably human, layered in polyphony. After several minutes, one clear phrase emerges in Russian, "We remember you." The analyst who transcribed it underlined the words 3 times and added, "If authentic, this is direct communication. Recommend immediate cessation of all experiments." No such cessation occurred. From this point onward, the files shift tone. What began as cautious observation has transformed into a confrontation with something vast, something that not only sings, but listens, remembers, and responds. The Soviet Union, already straining under political and economic collapse, now carried in its secret archives the weight of a presence under Baikal's ice, one that seemed less an anomaly and more an intelligence. And so 1985 marked a turning point. The Baikal voice was no longer just a rumor among fishermen or an inconvenience to divers. It had become a dialogue, unwanted yet undeniable, between the living and whatever choir echoed beneath the frozen depths. The 6th segment of the Baikal Voice dossier opens with an unsigned memorandum dated March 1986, a few weeks before the disaster at Chernobyl. The paper is brief, almost casual, but its implications are staggering. Increased frequency of harmonic episodes at Baikal coincides with heightened atmospheric ionization. Recommend correlation study. The link between nuclear instability and the lake's strange choir is never explained, but within months, reports from divers and shoreline personnel take on a far more urgent tone. That spring, a monitoring team near Listvianka recorded what they described as responsive choruses. For years, the phenomenon had been one-sided, voices rising from beneath the ice, but on April 22, 1986, 4 days before Chernobyl, the team broadcast a controlled acoustic pulse into the lake. Seconds later, the return signal carried not echoes, but a distorted version of their own broadcast, reshaped into polyphonic chant. "The lake repeated us," one operator wrote in his log, "but it made us sound older." The entry was confiscated. That night, several of the team reportedly heard the same chant in their dreams. Psychological incidents multiplied. Guards stationed on the frozen shoreline reported confusion over time, some swearing they had stood watch for days, though only hours had passed. One lieutenant filed a complaint that his soldiers were hearing their own voices calling from beneath the ice. The lieutenant himself disappeared days later. His uniform was found folded neatly near a crack in the lake. No body was recovered. The official line remained unchanged. Regional newspapers insisted that any strange sounds were seasonal ice expansion. But among local populations, fear deepened. Villagers claimed that the voices had grown louder, audible even without drilling holes in the ice. A Buryat elder told an ethnographer in 1987, "The lake has been fed too much. Now it is full of souls." He was later fined for religious agitation, but his words echo eerily in classified notes from the same year, which admit Civilian accounts consistent with operator testimonies. Cannot dismiss entirely. In 1988, a new phase of the project, codenamed Resonant Choir 2, attempted to provoke further responses. Hydrophones were lowered to depths of 150 meters, and experimental broadcasts of Russian speech were transmitted. One recording, partially declassified after 1991, captures the chilling aftermath, the voices of the divers themselves returning through the equipment, but layered, multiplied, distorted into song. The men swore they had not spoken a word. One transcript notes, unclear whether mimicry or direct sampling of subject consciousness. The experiment ended in disaster. 2 divers failed to surface. The survivors, hysterical, reported that the missing men had been surrounded by faces in the depths, pale and luminous, moving their mouths in unison. One survivor was later institutionalized in Irkutsk, where he continued to hum fragments of chant until his death. By the late 1980s, the files become increasingly fragmented, as though someone had begun purging them deliberately. Yet scattered entries confirm the phenomenon had not diminished. In 1989, a patrol boat reported hull vibrations in rhythm with distant singing, strong enough to rattle metal fixtures. In 1990, a geologist drilling near the lake bed recorded unexplained shifts in sediment cores, as though layers of earth had been folded and repeated like the grooves of a record. His notes include one phrase, "The ground remembers the choir." Amid the collapse of the Soviet Union, official attention turned elsewhere, but the Baikal station remained manned. In January 1991, the last intact report from the era states, "Choir events increasing, risk of exposure to civilians high, project unstable, recommend silence." The phrase "recommend silence" can be read 2 ways, as an instruction to cease experiments or as a final acknowledgement that the only response to the voices beneath the ice was to stop listening. But silence was never achieved. The villagers kept hearing. The files, though shredded, kept resurfacing. And the lake itself, older than empires, deeper than memory, continued to sing, its choirs rising through the cracks each winter, impossible to erase. The 7th section of the Baikal voice record begins in the turbulent years after the Soviet Union's collapse, when control over archives loosened and fragments of once forbidden material leaked into public circulation. These fragments, scattered across regional offices in Irkutsk and Moscow, reveal that the project did not simply vanish with the end of the USSR. If anything, the phenomenon became more dangerous in its neglect. In 1992, a fisherman from Sludyanka was pulled from the lake after vanishing for 2 weeks. He was found sitting calmly on the shoreline, clothing dry, eyes glassy. When questioned, he insisted no time had passed at all. "I went down for the net, and when I came up, you were already there waiting." His beard had grown, his body showed signs of starvation, yet he swore it had been only minutes. Doctors noted severe psychological disorientation. In his hospital room, nurses reported hearing him humming fragments of polyphonic chant in his sleep. The sound was so unsettling that they refused night shifts near his bed. His name disappeared from hospital records soon after. Journalists in Irkutsk began to pursue the story. In 1993, a small paper printed an article titled "The Singing Lake." It quoted locals who described hearing entire choirs beneath the ice, as if a cathedral lay submerged. The issue was seized within hours of distribution. The editor later admitted to colleagues that 2 plainclothes men arrived at his office and confiscated not only the article, but every draft, tape, and note. He was told bluntly, "Baikal does not sing. Forget it." At the same time, scientific institutes tried quietly to distance themselves from past experiments, yet stray memos reveal continued unease. A 1994 note from the Siberian branch of the Academy of Sciences admits, "Unexplained acoustic anomalies persist. Instruments register harmonics consistent with vocal ranges. Public release not advised." The language is dry, bureaucratic, but the very fact of acknowledgement is telling. Decades after denials, the files still admitted something unexplainable lingered under the ice. Meanwhile, folklore around Baikal took on a new edge. Locals told of hearing their names sung by the lake, especially those of the recently deceased. Families whispered that the drowned were not gone, but joining the choir. Herders in the steppes swore their animals refused to graze when the voices rose, standing motionless with ears pressed flat. Children dared one another to lie on the ice at night to hear the songs. Some never returned. The disappearances were written off as accidents, but villagers knew better. One of the most haunting testimonies from this period comes from a former Soviet diver who broke his silence in 1996. In a smuggled interview later circulated on cassette, he described descending into Baikal in the early 1980s and hearing a chorus that seemed to vibrate inside his bones. "It wasn't just sound," he said. "It was memory. I heard my mother's voice, though she had died years earlier. I heard words in a language I didn't know, but somehow understood." His voice trembled as he admitted, "They wanted me to stay. They sang of a place without time." The tape ends abruptly. Days later, the diver disappeared from his home. By the late 1990s, references to Baikal's voices had become a kind of forbidden folklore. Travelers spoke of strange dreams after camping near the lake, dreams filled with choirs singing beneath frozen domes. Amateur divers attempted expeditions, some returning with tales of distant lights in the depths, others not returning at all. One group's camera footage, briefly leaked before vanishing, shows indistinct shapes beneath the ice, pale and elongated, moving in rhythm as if conducting a hymn. The clip ends with the divers screaming and the feed cutting out. Officially, the footage never existed. What is striking in the seventh cluster of records is the transition from controlled secrecy to chaotic leakage. Under the Soviet state, the phenomenon was monitored, contained, suppressed. After the collapse, the machinery of denial faltered, and the voices of Baikal seeped into public rumor, folklore, and illicit testimony. Yet even then, the state, now fragmented but no less paranoid, still moved to silence, confiscate, and erase. The result is an archive more fractured than before, but no less chilling. Each fragment confirms the same unsettling truth. The choir beneath Baikal did not stop when the USSR fell. It continued, perhaps louder than ever, rising each winter, pulling in fishermen, divers, and wanderers alike. And the deeper into the 1990s the files go, the clearer one implication becomes. The voices are not content to remain unheard. They call out, they answer, they wait. The eighth cluster of the Baikal voice material opens in the winter of 2001, when the newly reorganized Russian security services inherited the scattered remnants of Soviet anomalous phenomena files. Among them, in a folder stamped Archive S, is a single chilling line: Lake Baikal. Acoustic anomaly persists. Civilian exposure unavoidable. Unlike the confident denials of the Soviet era, the tone here is resigned, almost weary, as if the phenomenon had become an accepted but unmanageable part of the landscape. In February of that year, a team of amateur divers from Novosibirsk attempted an unauthorized winter dive near Olkhon Island. Only one returned. His testimony, recorded by police but later sealed, describes a descent into a cathedral of sound. He swore that voices surrounded him, singing not in Russian, but in a language that felt carved into his mind. At 30 meters, he saw lights beneath the ice, moving in formation like lanterns carried in procession. Then faces, hundreds of them, pale and elongated, pressing upward against the ice. He panicked, rose too fast, and nearly died of decompression sickness. In the hospital, he whispered to nurses that the choir was welcoming new singers. His case disappeared from records after the FSB intervened. Satellite imagery from 2003 adds another layer. Analysts examining Baikal's frozen surface noticed concentric circles forming in the ice, perfect rings several kilometers wide, as if something beneath was radiating upward. Meteorologists attributed it to unusual currents, but internal memoranda note the timing. The rings appeared exactly during peak reports of choir nights, when locals claimed to hear the voices most clearly. An annotation scrawled in the margin reads, "Circles are not current, they are resonance." Civilian reports from nearby villages intensified. Residents described nights when the lake seemed to vibrate, the ice itself humming in unison. Dogs refused to leave their kennels, and children woke screaming, claiming they heard their dead grandparents singing lullabies through the walls. In one notorious case, a group of school children on a field trip reported hearing their own teacher's voice echoing from under the ice, even as she stood beside them, terrified. Officials dismissed the event as collective hysteria, but parents whispered that the children had been chosen to hear. By 2005, a small wave of independent researchers tried to investigate. A Moscow journalist named Petrov published an article titled "The Choir of the Drowned" in a short-lived magazine. He quoted fishermen, divers, and ex-military who described the same phenomenon, organized voices rising from the depths. Days after publication, Petrov was killed in a car accident under suspicious circumstances. His notes vanished. Colleagues later admitted he had been in possession of a reel-to-reel tape smuggled from Irkutsk archives, supposedly containing authentic recordings of the Baikal voices. That tape has never resurfaced. Meanwhile, local folklore began to shift. Older Buryat traditions described Baikal as a grave for the restless dead. Now, villagers whispered of the returning choir, not just voices of the drowned, but of the living, trapped in the lake before their deaths. Several families reported hearing songs that included the names of villagers who had not yet died, only to lose them weeks later in accidents or drownings. For locals, the phenomenon was no longer just eerie background, it was prophecy. A leaked FSB report from 2007 acknowledges this change. It warns of psychological contamination spreading among communities near the lake. The report notes a rise in suicides during winter months, often preceded by victims claiming they had heard their names sung at night. One particularly grim case involved a militia officer who shot himself after writing a single line in his notebook, "They have already sung for me." In 2009, the phenomenon briefly reached the international press. Satellite photos of the giant circles in Baikal's ice were published by NASA, sparking speculation about methane seeps or UFO activity. Russian authorities quickly dismissed the reports, but the timing again matched nights when locals insisted the lake sang the loudest. A Western scientist, after examining acoustic data, remarked privately, "This is not geological noise, it's composition." His words never made it into print. As the 2010s unfolded, the Baikal voice receded once again from mainstream attention, but the files suggest the phenomenon did not abate. Surveillance posts continued to operate under scientific cover, recording hours of sound that remain classified. Occasional leaks, whispers of chants, distorted choirs uploaded anonymously online, circulated briefly before vanishing. Those who listened too long reported headaches, hallucinations, and a compulsion to return to the recordings, as if the voices themselves demanded attention. The 8th segment of the dossier closes with an unsigned, undated note found tucked into a folder of unrelated hydrology surveys. The handwriting is jagged, hurried. It is not the drowned who sing. It is time itself, folding into harmony. Each winter they grow louder. Soon we will not be able to tell if it is we who listen, or they who are listening through us. This fragment, unmoored from context, lingers like an echo. It suggests that the Baikal voice is not merely a haunting chorus, not just a folkloric warning, but something deeper, an intelligence rising from the black waters, weaving memory, death, and sound into a single refrain. Something that resists erasure, no matter how many files are burned, no matter how many witnesses silenced. And as the file closes, the question left is not whether the voices exist, but how long before they sing not only beneath the ice, but above it. The ninth cluster of the Baikal voice material emerges from the fractured years of the 2010s, when secrecy could no longer fully suppress rumors, yet official denial persisted like a reflex. What survives are scattered testimonies, half-leaked recordings, and a handful of unnerving field notes from expeditions that were never meant for the public eye. Together they form a picture more chaotic than before, but also more terrifying. The voices had not faded. They were spreading. In 2011, a group of winter divers from Irkutsk University undertook a semi-official expedition under the pretense of limnological research. Their unofficial objective, preserved in their private notes later confiscated, was to capture direct recordings of the Baikal voice. They drilled through nearly a meter of ice and lowered digital hydrophones. The files they retrieved are mostly corrupted, yet fragments survive, layered tones, unmistakably human-like, woven into sequences that resemble hymnals. At minute 16 of one surviving track, a single Russian word emerges, distorted but clear. Vish, higher. The divers returned shaken, and within weeks, one of them drowned while swimming in a city pool. The others refused to speak publicly again. Villagers around Baikal began to tell new stories. They claimed that in certain winters, the voices no longer remained beneath the ice, but seemed to drift inland, audible in barns, on empty roads, even in children's bedrooms. One woman in 2013 reported her daughter waking nightly to a choir outside the window, though the family lived kilometers from the shoreline. When the mother pressed her ear to the wall, she heard nothing, but the child insisted the singers were waiting for her. The family moved to Irkutsk within the year. Leaked field notes from 2015 describe a joint Russian-Chinese research mission on Baikal, publicly announced as a study of methane seeps. In the classified annex, however, researchers note persistent low-frequency harmonics unrelated to geological activity. Some of the Chinese technicians reportedly refused to continue after nights of hearing singing through the hull of their boats. One account, hastily translated, reads, "Not wind, not ice, they know we are here." Moscow never acknowledged this portion of the expedition. Digital technology allowed the phenomenon to escape containment. Between 2016 and 2018, anonymous recordings surfaced online, clips of eerie choirs with the unmistakable reverberation of underwater acoustics. Forums debated whether they were hoaxes, but listeners described identical symptoms: headaches, dizziness, and a compulsion to replay the tracks. One user wrote, "The more I listen, the more it feels like they are learning me." The files vanished within weeks, scrubbed from servers. Some accounts that uploaded them were deleted entirely, their owners never traced. Folklore shifted again. The Buryat elders began to speak less of the drowned and more of the calling winter, when the lake seeks new voices to join its choir. Younger villagers dared one another to sleep on the ice, claiming the voices would whisper their future. In 2017, 3 teenagers vanished near Olkhon Island during such a dare. Their sleds and supplies were found untouched, their tracks leading onto the ice and stopping abruptly. No cracks, no signs of struggle, only silence. Their families insisted they had been sung away. By 2019, the FSB renewed restrictions around parts of Baikal, citing environmental protection. Yet internal memos describe patrols hearing the voices even on land. One officer wrote, "It follows us now. Not only the lake sings, the forest carries the notes." The phrase was underlined, then struck out in red. His report was filed under psychological contamination. The most chilling entry of this decade comes from an undated USB drive leaked to journalists in 2020. The file contained a single audio clip labeled B Choir Final. For 20 minutes it plays indistinct harmonics, until at last the sound resolves into what every analyst identified as a Russian Orthodox hymn, sung not in modern voice, but in 1,000 overlapping tones, as though generations were singing at once. At minute 20, a whisper cuts through. "We are above the ice now." The file was dismissed publicly as fabrication, but those who heard it swear the final line was not a recording glitch. It was an announcement. Thus, the Baikal voice enters the 2020s not as a submerged anomaly, but as something that seems to be climbing upward, leaving the confines of the lake itself. The more the state denies it, the more locals insist it grows stronger. The archive becomes less a record of the past than a warning of what may already be unfolding. And in these scattered notes, one thought repeats like an echo. Perhaps the Soviet Union never silenced the voices at all. Perhaps it only delayed their arrival. For if once they sang beneath the ice, and now they sing above it, the next question is inevitable. How long before the choir spreads beyond Baikal entirely? The 10th and final stratum of the Baikal voice dossier is the most fragmented and perhaps the most unsettling. It consists not of orderly reports, but of scattered notes, confiscated testimonies, and unsigned memoranda, as though even the act of documenting had become dangerous. Together they form a mosaic, less of explanation than of warning, a record of something that refused to remain buried beneath the ice. One of the last intact reports, dated January 2021, describes a group of scientists stationed near Listvianka who recorded choral anomalies, not from the lake itself, but from the sky above it. Their log notes strange harmonics captured by atmospheric sensors, resembling the same layered frequencies once heard beneath Baikal's surface. The conclusion is terse, almost terrified. Phenomenon no longer localized. Shortly afterward, the entire team was recalled, their equipment removed under armed guard. The official explanation given to the press was budget cuts. Civilian testimonies from the same winter suggest the choir had begun to break free of its boundaries. Herders on the steppes swore they heard human singing rolling across the snow, though no one was present. Families in shoreline villages reported hearing voices calling them by name in the night, not from under the ice, but from their rooftops. A fisherman claimed he saw figures walking on the frozen surface, dressed in archaic clothing, their mouths open in silent song. When he shouted, they dissolved like mist, leaving only the echo of harmonies in his ears. Digital traces persist as well. In 2022, an anonymous channel uploaded a 1-minute audio clip said to have been recorded on Baikal's western shore. Within hours, it spread across forums, a choir of impossible depth, voices overlapping in dozens of registers, until at the final second, a phrase in Russian emerges: "The choir grows." The clip was deleted within 24 hours. Those who had downloaded it reported nightmares of drowning in glassy water, of looking upward through ice while voices pressed down from above. Whispers inside Russian archives speak of a new designation for Baikal, Zone Coral. Supposedly, security services now treat the region as a contamination risk, not chemical, not biological, but temporal and psychological. An unsigned memo recovered from a burned folder reads, "Containment no longer feasible. Do not listen directly. Transmissions carry influence." The implication is that the Baikal voice is not only audible, but transmissible, capable of embedding itself into human minds through sound alone. Meanwhile, folklore continues to mutate. Elders no longer speak only of the drowned, but of the living being summoned early, their names sung before death arrives. Parents forbid their children from walking the frozen lake, fearing the choir will recognize their voices. Some villagers refuse to speak their names aloud at night, believing that to be named is to be claimed. The scattered documents end not with resolution, but with a final, undated fragment typed on thin paper, unsigned. They no longer wait beneath the ice. They are among us now. We are not observers. We are instruments. And that is the most chilling possibility the Baikal files leave us with, that the choir was never a passive echo, but an intelligence searching for resonance. That every diver who heard it, every fisherman who listened too long, every archivist who replayed the reels, became part of something larger, a choir growing note by note, voice by voice. The Soviet Union tried to silence it, failed, and buried the evidence. The Russian Federation denies it even exists, but the voices remain, surfacing in every generation, calling to those who cannot resist. So the archive closes not with certainty, but with a question. Did Baikal simply hold the voices of the drowned, or did it carry something older, something that learned to use human sound as its instrument? And if the last fragment is true, then perhaps the choir no longer needs the lake at all. Perhaps it is already singing through us, and somewhere, beneath the shifting ice, the voices continue, rising, waiting, echoing a refrain we were never meant to hear.